The year is 1936. The event is the largest propaganda operation of all time. And no, this isn't some fascism party rally. This is the 1936 Olympics, a perfect stage for what would become the most corrupt event of all time. The Olympics is a cartel. A cartel preying on a dream. Take Tonga. Their princess wanted so badly to see a citizen in the Winter Olympics, they hired a German marketing company to find an athlete. This led them to choose the unlikely sport of luge, and the even more unlikely competitor, Bruno Banani, the son of a coconut farmer who had never seen real ice before. He was shipped to Germany and began training, and it turns out he was surprisingly good at this whole luge thing, making it to the Olympic trials, and exceeding until... Where did this all start, and why do we care so much? The modern Olympic Games began in 1896 by a French aristocrat as a way of reviving national pride after his country didn't do so well versus Germany in the Franco-Russian War. That's why athletes represent countries rather than themselves, and why Hitler staged the 1936 Games as a kind of showcase for rising German military might and aggression. During the Cold War, the Olympics functioned as yet another proxy battle between the free world and communism. Later, when the US and Soviet teams faced off in sporting events, it was every bit as much of a geopolitical showdown between superpowers as anything happening in Southeast Asia at the time. Bruce Jenner, in his world record-setting 1967 decathlon victory, wasn't just about surpassing the limits of the human body. It was somehow a metaphor for real politics and nuclear war. But this framing wasn't without collateral damage. With ongoing national boycotts over political disputes, athletes who had trained for years were figuratively sacrificed on the altar of nationalism. Or in the case of murdered Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Games, literally killed in the name of international politics. Even in 2022, with the Olympics taking place in the winter wonderland of China, where the snow is totally fake, but the silencing of American athletes is all too real, I have to stop and ask myself, how much worse can it get? And it turns out much worse. For Bruno Banani, he had crashed in his trials, just missing qualification and failing his country. Out of money, he had no place to go. That is until a fantastic coincidence happens. It turns out the name Bruno Banani was also the name of a popular German underwear brand. They saw Bruno and had to sponsor him, helping him to train for the next Winter Olympics. Bruno was becoming a kind of celebrity in the luge world. This Tongan with the perfect underdog story and even better name. That is until journalists began to look into his background. Meet the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. According to the New York Times, the International Olympic Committee is probably the most pervasive sport infrastructure in the world and arguably the least accountable. These guys play so dirty, they make even the filthiest events look spotless. Take the Utah scandal. And they weren't done yet because it happened again and again. And so many times after that there's an entire Wikipedia page dedicated to the scandals and corruption within the IOC.
I think that the entire system is corrupt. You have to take away the power of the members of the IOC to decide who gets to host the Olympic Games.
So the Olympics has more scandals than Bill Cosby had an all-you-can-drink resort. But who are they? Or what are they? Well, every couple of years, the elusive IOC creatures come out of hibernation to feed on the blood of whatever host country is gullible enough to put on the Olympics. The thing is, you can't technically own an event, but you can own the rights to the intellectual property of an event. And if you thought that the IOC might share those rights with countries or athletes, think again. Not even the local businesses are safe. Not the butcher, the baker, or the tire replacer.
The USOC says businesses cannot use their own versions and has threatened to sue anyone who uses its trademarks without consent.
This causes businesses and athletes to bend the rules a little bit. And it turns out Bruno Banani wasn't actually Bruno Banani, the son of a coconut farmer. Instead, he was a man named Fwahia Simi, a Tongan who was plucked out of the crowd by a certain German marketing company, had his name changed to Bruno Banani, and had his fingers crossed that the underwear brand of the same name would sponsor his efforts to be an Olympian. And it worked. But the problem is you're only allowed one bad snow job before your entire reputation is tainted. And the IOC was leaving a regrettable taste in countries' mouths. They needed a new approach. So why not try a corporate PSA? Basically, their pitch is paying us is good for you. But is it actually? Consider this. Every year since 1960, countries have significantly overspent to host the event. Take Rio in 2016. They told Rio it would only cost about $3 billion to put on the Olympics. In reality, it cost $20 billion. Of course, it's not free to host an Olympics. You need to build infrastructure, dope testing facilities, and hotels. And you might be thinking, yeah, but countries get to keep the buildings, and they benefit from those buildings, which is true, but it's not cheap to maintain oversized, multi-billion-dollar facilities. Here are some of the pictures of Rio after the 2016 Games. But surely the Games themselves bring in revenue to countries. I mean, these are large televised events. So where's that money actually going? Turns out the majority goes to, you guessed it, the IOC. Okay. The city doesn't get the lion's share of money, but they do get secondary benefits that are harder to measure, like spending in the economy and bragging rights. But what about the athletes, the people who literally make the events, the people who sacrifice their entire lives to perfect their craft? They've got to be well paid, right? Well, no, they're unpaid, zero. They are completely reliant on sponsors, if they're lucky enough to get a sponsor. In a recent study of 500 elite athletes, 60% consider themselves financially unstable. The average track and field runner at the Olympics makes less than $25,000 a year, and that's one of the main events. The niche sports earn even less. I was actually a pole vaulter back in the day, believe it or not. Not at an Olympic level, but I did it for about 8 years, and it was absolutely my passion for a long time, and I even earned a scholarship for it. One of the biggest reasons I stopped pursuing the dream to live as a pole vaulter was the income. The best in the world, even Olympians were struggling to get by. So how could I, someone relatively good, ever live off of this? Some Olympians have resorted to another approach, crowdfunding to pay their bills. There is an exception though. Winners get paid more. Most countries offer bonuses to athletes who win medals. However, the amount is totally dependent on where you live. If you're in the US, it's not much. But despite the money, the prestige still matters, and this means countries and athletes do anything they can to try to get into the Olympics. For Bruno, this meant changing his name and faking a life. But this doesn't take away from his skill. He still trained and worked to compete on the world stage. The IOC hated this. They hated the idea that a company could profit off of the advertisement that is essentially a man's name. They hated it because they couldn't charge Bruno Banani, the brand that is, massive advertisement fees, adding even more to their Olympic stash. But how much exactly are they making? Well, the IOC is a nonprofit. We know the president makes about $243,000 per year, but the rest is a bit more murky. The Olympics likes to promote that it redistributes 90% of its earnings, which they mention many times in their annual report. This might make you scratch your head a little bit when you add up the operations and administrative costs in that same report, and you see it comes out to $670 million on $5.7 billion in revenue. But sure, they might just say 10% for the sake of rounding. But where's the remaining 90% redistributed to? The Olympic Channel? Promotion of the Olympic movement? I mean, don't get me wrong, there are good things in the mix here, like scholarships to athletes, but I would just like to see a little bit more transparency. I'm not pointing any fingers, but it's all too easy for a nonprofit to funnel a few million by simply hiring contractors owned by insiders of a nonprofit, all in the name of regular operational expenses. What we know for certain is the Olympics draws a lot of money. It pays very little and has a questionable past. As for Bruno, he ended up qualifying for and competing in the Winter Olympics despite thousands of attempts to disparage his name. And he'll go down in history as not only an Olympian, but one of the greatest guerrilla marketers of all time. And if you see me pole vaulting in 2024 under the name Tommy, mind your own business.
And he goes over.